Hi, my name is Emily. I am the greenhouse manager at the American Plant Beltway location. And today we're going to talk about repotting orchids. Very fun subject. It can be not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to everyone when you know when or when not to repot an orchid. So today we're going to let you know and show you how to do it. So if an orchid appears to have outgrown its pot, or its roots look very tangled, or you see that roots are starting to rot, that is a good indication that it's time to repot your orchid. Repotting doesn't always mean putting into a larger pot. Sometimes you just get rotten roots because you accidentally watered a little bit too much, and that's fine. You can fix that by giving it some fresh potting medium. And by potting medium, we don't call it soil because it's soilless. The potting medium is one of the most important parts of repotting your orchid. So the Phalaenopsis orchid, which is the one that we're all very common with, is an epiphyte, meaning it grows above the ground on trees. They are native to South and Southeast Asia. So these roots here that we see are actually not all meant just for capturing water like a terrestrial plant. They can fuse to the sides of trees where they can cling. So sometimes you'll see them mounted on boards, or in Florida they're lucky enough that they can actually grow them on their trees outside in their yard. So these roots, because they're not naturally in soil, are very susceptible to getting rotted, which is why it's so important to use a very tight container and to use the proper potting medium, as well as allowing it to dry out very thoroughly in between watering. So one indication that it's time to repot your plant is these air roots. They're called air roots because they're exposed to the air, are actually normal, but and this amount I would say is normal, but once you start to see like 10, 15 of these aerial roots, it means that the plant is not receiving adequate moisture from the current pot and it's ready to move on to a bigger pot so it can get the moisture that it needs to survive. So, the potting medium. We call it potting medium because there's actually no soil in it. There's lots of different correct ways to do something, so the way that I explain may not be the same that somebody else would explain to you or that you might find online, but this is just the way that we prefer. So the fir bark is important to use. It's nice and porous, so this will retain moisture. So I like to use a mixture of fir bark and sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss is great at holding moisture. And I like to also add just a little bit of horticultural grade charcoal. This charcoal has been treated. It's different than what you would find for like barbecues and things. So we recommend using professional grade horticultural charcoal for anything plant related. So everyone likes to use different ratios. Some growers you'll see use 100% sphagnum moss, and that's fine. That just means you don't need to water as often. I like to check up on my orchids frequently, so I like to use a mixture of sphagnum moss and bark, 50% sphagnum, 50% bark, and then I just sprinkle some charcoal in the top, and that just helps to keep the air pure, and it prevents bad smells and things since they're going to stay wet for kind of a little while. So just as important as the potting medium is the pot. So Phalaenopsis orchids, since they're epiphytes, like to receive a lot of airflow on their roots. And their roots are also capable of photosynthesizing, The leaves do most of the work, but a lot of growers will like to keep them in these clear pots. First, because the roots can photosynthesize, and second, because you can actually really see the moisture in there and you can really tell when it's time to water because it's clear. So we have our pot. We have a pot with slits in the side. You can also get decorative ceramic pots. You've probably seen them at stores. Ceramic pots with just holes in the side. And those are orchid pots for epiphytic orchids. The soil doesn't fall out, or the potting mixture doesn't fall out. The holes are just to allow for proper airflow. So to pick the right size of container, as I mentioned earlier, the Phalaenopsis like to be very tight in their pot. So if we're using this orchid as an example, you wouldn't pot down unless you had a lot of dead roots and were only left with a few living ones, in which case you may actually want to move into a smaller pot. So something like this, because it's so tight in the pot and it does have a few roots coming out, I would probably move it into a bigger pot. You don't want to go much larger than 2 inches bigger than what it's currently in. So this is in a 4-inch pot. I'm going to select the 6-inch pot for that. So let's get started with our orchid. So the first step after selecting the right pot is preparing the potting mixture, which I mentioned all the components of. I have a pre-prepared mixture here of sphagnum moss, bark, and charcoal. I like to get it nice and wet beforehand, but not soggy. So if you get a handful of this and it's very wet from watering, you'll want to just squeeze it out before using it. But this right here, semi-moist, is the perfect moisture level for this situation. So we've prepared the potting medium. Now it's time to actually remove the orchid from the pot. And a side note, you don't really typically want to repot your orchids, Phalaenopsis or any other type, while they're blooming because it can cause shock. I'm just going to remove this stake because it's not very useful to me right now. And then there's a hole in the bottom of the pot. I'm just going to rip it out. Okay, it's very tight. You can see all those roots. This orchid is, I would say, ready to be repotted. So now that we have our pot and our mixture, it's time to trim off any dead roots. So this is our very, very ready to be repotted orchid. So you're going to be analyzing and seeing if there are any dead roots. Luckily, this one looks pretty healthy. Removing the old moss can help remove any existing pathogens, so we just gently break it away. And you can come back later with your pruners and actually prune the root part. That's not just the spongy outer coating. You can see some of these roots are healthier than others, so this one we're just going to remove because we don't want any sort of vessel for fungus that can lead to root rot. That's why we get rid of the old roots. So for this example, we are using an out of bloom orchid. You can see the old stalks that have been trimmed off. If this did have a living stalk, I may or may not trim it off depending on which school of thought I subscribe to. Some people say to cut the orchid stem off as soon as it's done reblooming. I like to leave them on for 1 year because sometimes they'll surprise you and you'll get a whole new flower spike coming out of the old spike. If the spike turns yellow or brown, it means that it decided it was done, and in which case you can cut it off. Nothing is going to grow from a brown or yellow stem. So we've cleaned out all of that old potting medium, and now that we have done all of that, we're actually going to pot it. So this is the right size pot. I like to start out by putting a little bit on the bottom. Sometimes it's a little trial and error. So this looks to be about right. The crown of the orchid, which is this part right here, is above the soil. So that's important. You don't want to bury it this deep or else this whole part of the plant will rot. So you want it to rest at the line, at the same level that it was before. So I have some down there. I put it on top, my old orchid, and then I hold it in place, and then I just start shoving it in. It's just as easy as repotting any other plant, actually. And all of these roots do not need to be covered. I like the way they look personally. Not everyone does. So you can really leave these out, or you can force them to go under the pot, but I'm just going to leave them out because I like them. And I'm just shoving. And if the roots break, it's really not the end of the world because the spongy coating can break and the root is still viable. So if you hear some snapping, it's okay. We try to avoid it, but these things happen. Okay. And that is all there is to it. Now we have a freshly repotted orchid, and you can keep it in this pot until you see lots of roots circling the outside. That's really it. It's that easy. You can do it yourself. We have all the supplies that you need at American Plant, and we are always happy to talk to you about the process if you are unsure. So just come on in and say hi.